Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. In our last episode, we set the pop cultural scene of early 1963. In this episode, we're going to talk in depth about the Beach Boys' early 1963 album release, Surfin USA. This was their sophomore album, a follow-up to the prior year's Surfin Safari album. This one certainly played with much more confidence and much more power than that first album. And more than any other Beach Boys album, this one revolves around a single release, Surfin' USA, the title track, and its B-side, Shutdown. I think anybody buying this album in 1963 was certainly buying it based on the strength of that single. The single was released on March 4th, 1963, exactly 3 weeks before the album. And because it's such an important part of the Surfin' USA album, let's talk about the Surfin' USA single first. And just briefly, let's touch on what was on the singles chart at the time this was released. We talked about the singles at the beginning of 1963. We talked extensively about the albums last time. And as we saw, there were a lot of different genres going on in 1963. Rock and roll seemed to be taking a back seat a bit. There was certainly a lot of rock and roll releases yet, but there was also a lot of room on the charts for comedy records, personality records, folk records, R&B, soundtrack albums, a lot going on besides rock and roll. At the time Surfin' USA was released, the #1 single in the country was Walk Like a Man by the Four Seasons. This was the Four Seasons' third #1 in a row, not counting their seasonal release Santa Claus Is Coming to Town, since the Four Seasons began charting back in the fall of 1962. And #2 was another of those increasingly rare rock and roll records, Ruby Baby by Dion. This is a great record. It has a nice loose feel to it, and you can certainly see why the Beach Boys thought of it as a potential track for inclusion on their Party album 2.5 years later. At #3 was another track aimed squarely at the younger set, Hey Paula by Paul and Paula, which had been a #1 hit in early February of the year. At #4 was Rhythm of the Rain by the Cascades. At #5 was another former #1 hit, Walk Right In by the Rooftop Singers. It had been #1 in late January of '63. I was surprised to see that the sleeve for the single noted that it was from Vanguard, the company that gave you Joan Baez. The Rooftop Singers' take on folk is so much more candy-coated and commercial than Joan Baez. I'm not sure this did the Rooftop Singers any favors. I'm not sure it did Joan Baez any favors. And I've got to believe anybody that bought this expecting a Joan Baez type song was sorely disappointed. At #6 was You're the Reason I'm Livin' by Bobby Darin. The #7 single was part of the bossa nova craze we discussed earlier, Edie Gourmet's Blame It on the Bossa Nova. At #8 was Ned Miller's rather forgettable hit, From a Jack to a King. At #9 was another great rock and roll record, the sax-driven instrumental Wild Weekend by the Rebels. And rounding out the top 10 was Johnny Mathis with What Will My Mary Say? As for the Beach Boys, the Surfin' Safari single had reached a very respectable #14 on the chart in 1962, while its follow-up, 10 Little Indians, had kind of understandably tanked. It was probably for this reason, the fact that they weren't yet proven hit makers with a built-in following, that it took the Surfin' USA single a little while to move up the charts. It finally peaked after 11 weeks on the chart on May 25th, 1963. And for comparison, by 1965, Beach Boys singles were routinely peaking after 7 weeks. When it did reach its top position, it was at #3, behind Jimmy Soul's novelty record, If You Want to Be Happy, which was at #1, and at #2, Little Peggy March's ode to teen devotion, I Will Follow Him. While researching this episode, I came across an ad for Surfin' USA from a trade publication dated April 6, 1963, just as Surfin' USA was moving from 63 to 45 on the US chart, thanking industry insiders for making the single a success, though obviously it still had a long way to go. Interestingly, at the bottom it gives special thanks to all the swingin' DJs in Australia and to Radio Sweden and Klaus Berling. Klaus Berling was a Swedish DJ who later in 1963 was instrumental in bringing the Beatles to Sweden for their first taste of real large-scale success outside the UK. Apparently he was also instrumental in breaking Surfin' USA on the Swedish charts, where it would reach #6. Klaus Berling was definitely having a good year in 1963, introducing both the Beach Boys and the Beatles to Swedish audiences. Surfin USA would also go to number 6 in Canada, and in the summer of 1963, it would go to number 8 in Australia, number 9 in Hong Kong, and number 9 in Japan. The opposite corner of the ad shows Personal Management by Murray C. Wilson and gives the Wilsons' home address in Hawthorne, California as the contact. Also, interestingly, it still doesn't show a zip code. Zip codes would first be launched in the U.S. later on in 1963. As for the song itself, it's no secret that Surfin' USA uses the tune from Chuck Berry's Sweet Little 16 with new surfin' lyrics written by Brian Wilson. It's kind of strange that for Brian Wilson, somebody who is so well known for writing melodies and collaborating with other people on lyrics, that on his first top 5 hit, he wrote the lyrics but not the melody. In any case, the single came out originally credited to Brian Wilson. Not surprisingly, Chuck Berry's publishers, Arc Music, took note and sued. The sheet music has the correct credits of lyrics Brian Wilson, music Chuck Berry. As settlement, Arc Music was paid an undisclosed sum of money, and the entire credit for the song was shifted to Chuck Berry as it appears on my 1964 copy of the album. Brian hasn't been coy about this at all. He's widely quoted as saying, "I thought, God, why not put surfing lyrics to the melody of Sweet Little 16, and that he enlisted his girlfriend Judy's brother, Jimmy Bowles, a local surfer, to make a list of all the surfing hotspots for the lyrics." In an annoying side note, later in 1963, Chess Records issued Chuck Berry on Stage, which, according to the big print on the front, includes Surfin' USA. Now, not only is this not a live album, it's just studio recordings with audience effects dubbed over them. Surfin' USA is just the original version of Sweet Little 16 with audience effects dubbed on it, and they just call it Surfin' USA on the cover. Carl said he took his great opening guitar lick from Duane Eddy's 1958 song Movin' and Groovin', which is a great track in and of itself, and you can definitely hear the similarity in the opening of the two records. This was also the first time that Brian had double-tracked vocals, which gives the song a strength that's clearly missing from their earlier work. Between Carl's lead guitar and Mike's vocal, the song has a lot of high end, which seems to be missing from a lot of other songs on the radio early in 1963. I can really see how this track would have stood out and cut through next to other things on the radio at the time, and I'm sure that coming as it did late in the cold, snowy winter of 62-63, it really spoke to a lot of other people across the country who couldn't wait for June. The B-side of the single, Shutdown, is of course now another Beach Boy classic. It was also the first released collaboration between Brian Wilson and KFWB disc jockey and car enthusiast Roger Christian, who wrote the lyrics. The lyrics began as a 32-line poem called Last Drag about a race between a Chevy Impala and an Oldsmobile 88, which Roger Christian released as a dramatic reading over a surf guitar instrumental. It was, of course, rewritten for Shutdown as a race between a Chevy Corvette Stingray and a 413 Superstock Dodge Dart. The track doesn't have quite the power of Surfin' USA, but it roars along nicely. The double-track vocal arrangement is a little more ambitious, and I like Mike's goofy two-note sax solo. It's one of those cases where bonehead simple is exactly what's called for, the kind of thing the Ramones would build a career on over a decade later. As mentioned in the last episode, because chart performance in those days was based in part on radio play, a B-side could chart separately from an A-side, and that's the case with Shutdown. It charted, it peaked at number 23 on June 22, 1963, 4 weeks after Surfin' USA had reached its peak of number 3. The Surfin' USA album kicks off with the single Surfin' USA, followed by Farmer's Daughter. Apart from the two sides of the single, this is my favorite track on the album. I love Brian's wild falsetto vocals and the tight backing vocal arrangement. I like the simplicity of the backing track, though again, the backing track sounds as if it may have been inspired by parts of Movin' and Groovin' by Duane Eddy. Lyrically, as on much of the first two albums, they seem to be looking for a direction that works for them outside of surfing in cars. Of course, there were and still are literally hundreds of jokes about the traveling salesman and the farmer's daughter, and being on the road all the time, I imagine the Beach Boys told a few. The lyrics here work a little bit better than some of their other non-surf, non-drag lyrics from the period, but they're clearly still looking for their voice to sing about other subject matter at this early point in their careers. Next up is the first of many surf instrumentals on the album, a perfectly adequate cover of Dick Dale's signature tune, Miser Lou, with Carl on lead guitar. This is a little less intense than Dick Dale's original, and it dispenses with the horn section that Dick Dale used, which to my ears improves it, getting it firmly out of Herb Alpert territory and making it more of what we would now call a kind of a punk record. The song itself is a Middle Eastern or Mediterranean folk tune of uncertain origin. I believe Dick Dale knew it through his Greek heritage. I have no idea how it came to be credited to N. Rubanus, Fred Wise, Milton Leeds, and S.K. Russell. If you haven't, you should check out one of the older folk recordings of Miser Lou here on YouTube. Knowing what Dick Dale and the Beach Boys did with it, it's really fun to hear what it originally sounded like. Next up is a Brian Wilson surf instrumental called Stoked, or as it's pronounced, Stoked. Again, this is a track prominently showcasing Carl's lead guitar. As I've mentioned before, when most bands put an instrumental on an album, it's usually clear that it's filler. Brian's instrumentals, on the other hand, are usually highlights. We haven't quite reached that stage yet here. It's a perfectly enjoyable piece of surf guitar, but mainly it's just another track to fill the album. More memorable is the next track, The Lonely Sea, which at 2 minutes and 25 seconds is the second longest track on the album after Surfin' USA. This began life as a Gary Usher lyric, which Brian adapted and set to music. It features a beautiful falsetto vocal from Brian. They hadn't done anything quite this moody before, and it's a very beautiful track and presages even greater things to come. Side 1 is closed out with the single Shutdown, which cuts in kind of abruptly and strangely ends side 1 rather than kicking off side 2, where I would have thought they probably would have placed it in the sequence. Side 2 does, however, begin with The Noble Surfer, a goofy, tongue-in-cheek, over-the-top salute to a mythical surfer hero sung mainly by Mike. The vocal arrangement is more like something we would have heard on the Surfin' Safari album. It runs 1 minute and 55 seconds, which is long enough. It's not particularly memorable, but it is kind of fun. Next up is another instrumental, a cover of Bill Doggett's Honky Tonk. The Bill Doggett original was issued on a 45 with part 1 on side 1 and part 2 on side 2. The original was slower, moodier, it featured a saxophone, and sounded like something that you would have heard at a very sleazy night spot. Carl's guitar brightens it and gives it more of a surfing sheen. That's followed by Lana, which has another nice Brian Wilson falsetto backed by the group. There's also a nice break featuring guitar from Carl and a Celeste apparently played by Brian. It's simple, it doesn't have a middle 8. Underdeveloped is the word most often associated with this tune. At 1 minute 43 seconds, it's tied with Finders Keepers as the shortest of all the very short tracks that make up the album. With so many wild Brian Wilson falsettos on this album, I have to wonder if he was influenced by the Four Seasons' recent success with things like Sherry and Big Girls Don't Cry. The next track on the album is Carl's first writing credit, another surf instrumental called Surf Jam. This one really rips along and features some apparently impromptu shouts in the background from Dennis and Brian, which really give it energy and make it probably my favorite of the surf instrumentals on the album. One more surf instrumental follows, which is Let's Go Trippin', another of Dick Dale's signature tunes. Like their version of Miser Lou, the Beach Boys have simplified the arrangement. Dick Dale's version is a little more powerful and features a saxophone break. Something in the way it's played here kind of reminds me of a jack-in-the-box being wound at high speeds. The final track on the album is Finders Keepers. Lyrically, this seems like another of those early tunes in which the group is trying to find its voice. It could be called a surf song since it's actually about a stolen surfboard, but it seems to have more in common with Heads I Win, Tails You Lose from Surfin' Safari. There's a somewhat awkward tempo change between the verses and the choruses sound a bit like the Four Seasons' recent hit, Big Girls Don't Cry. With this track, and really with all the tracks here, it's worth cutting the group some slack. Success had come to them so quickly that they were doing a lot of their development and learning on major label records rather than in their garage or in their bedrooms like most groups. They were bound to be looking for their voice at this point and experimenting with some things like tempo changes that didn't always work. Like the single, the Surfin' Safari album was a major chart success, going to the number 2 spot for 2 weeks in 1963. The album that kept it out of the number 1 position was Andy Williams' juggernaut album, Days of Wine and Roses, which spent 15 weeks at number 1. All in all, Surfin' USA is a fun romp that points to bigger things ahead. By the standards of 1963 surfin' albums, it's not just solid, it's essential. In 1963, surfin' albums were meant to be fun, party albums, and in this, Surfin' USA more than succeeds. It's that energy and simplicity that makes it a fun listen to this day. Please let me know what you think about this album. I'd love to hear your comments, what you think of the album, any interesting facts that I may have missed. Next time we'll move away from 1963. There's plenty more to talk about here. The Beach Boys released 2 more albums in '63, but we'll leave that for another time. We'll move on to other topics next time. Hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe. I really look forward to your comments, and we'll see you again next week. Thanks. Bye.